The Revenant, a noun describing a person who has returned, specifically from the dead. At this point, almost everyone knows about the 2015 film that practically immortalized Hugh Glass, making his incredible story known to millions. But when I was watching the movie, I found myself often thinking, did that actually happen? So today I'm going to tell the full story of Hugh Glass from beginning to end, and you can decide for yourself if he was just as badass in real life. Little is known of Glass before 1822, and the best source of his early life comes in the form of George Yount's memoirs, which was his close friend throughout the 1820s. He had told George many stories before he had become a trapper, but their legitimacy is questionable at best, since it was very traditional for mountain men to embellish their stories at the time. According to these stories, Glass worked on a merchant ship by the west coast of the Americas. One day his ship fell prey to Jean Lafitte, a very notorious pirate throughout the 1820s. And he was given a very clear choice: become a pirate or die. So Glass reluctantly joins Lafitte and his crew. He describes his life during this time as monstrosities of conduct, belonging to a society which has cut itself off from honor and compassion. After 2 years of being a pirate, Glass and another comrade began discussing their deep dissatisfaction for the business, but shortly, other pirates started picking up on this. Fearing for their lives, they jumped overboard that night and swam to shore of what is now modern-day Texas. At this point in history, they were very deep in native territory, conscious to avoid the east, where the Karankawa tribe were notorious for eating settlers in a dish they called the long pig. They pressed north, living off the land for a month, roughly covering 1,000 miles before finding themselves captured once again. Their captors were the Pawnee tribe, so they breathed a sigh of relief knowing that at least they weren't going to be eaten. But little did they know, the tribe had plans for much worse. Initially, they were treated fairly well, but their prolonged imprisonment had a dark purpose. The Pawnee tribe was one of the very few tribes that practiced human sacrifice, and this is what they intended for the two men. Glass's friend was tied to the stake, having resinous pine needles shoved into his skin before they set him alight, all the while stabbing him with burning stakes. When it was Glass's turn, he bowed in front of the chief, giving him his stash of cinnabar, which he had collected while passing through Texas. Now, cinnabar was a very rare material at the time, which the indigenous used for pottery, makeup, but specifically war paint. And this gift impressed the chief so much that he spared Glass from sacrifice, making him an honorary guest of the tribe. Glass spent several years with the tribe, and during this time learned the tracking and trapping skills necessary for entering the fur trade. Now, it is undisputed that Glass spent at least 2 years with the Pawnee, but it was unclear how involved he actually was with the tribe. Some timelines of Glass depict him as taking a Pawnee wife, and sometimes even swearing that he had a half-native son that he named Hawk, just like in the movie. Now, it is unclear that any of this is true, but one thing is for certain: if he did indeed have a son, he was not accompanied by him during his years as a trapper. Flash forward to 1823, when Glass and the chief had gone to St. Louis to meet with the U.S. Superintendent of Indian Affairs. But when the pair was done their business, Glass had chose to remain in civilized society, leaving the chief to ride home alone back to the tribe. It was at this time that Glass answered the ad in the Missouri Republican by the Rocky Mountain Fur Trading Company, seeking 100 men with the necessary skills to trap beaver. He was hired by the group's leader, General William Ashley, and they were set to depart in March of 1823 for a several-year-long expedition to harvest pelts from the Rockies. Everything went smoothly until Ashley went ashore to parley with the Arikara people, otherwise known as the Rees. A deal was struck: 50 Ree horses for a few kegs of gunpowder, and then they set up camp on a sandbar near the Arikara village. Now, at this point, the Rees were one of the tribes that the American settlers had one of the most friendly, if not the best, relationships with. But after their recent parley, they had a change of heart. They saw themselves as middlemen for trade up and down the river, and they didn't appreciate Ashley's attempt to cut them out of the loop. That night, 2 significant events took place. The first is that 3 Arikara scouts snuck onto the boat attempting to assassinate Ashley. Lucky for him, he was still awake and drove them off with pistol fire. The second is that Edward Rose and Aaron Stevens secretly went to the Arikara camp looking to fornicate with the native women. Amidst all the chaos of Ashley trying to calm down the men after the failed assassination, Rose comes running into camp screaming that Stevens has been murdered. And this brings us to the scene in the movie where we can see Rose here running back to alert the others. At first light, the Rees attacked Ashley's company with the very same muskets and gunpowder that they had traded for the day earlier, wounding Glass and killing 15 others. Ashley swore he would not leave the area until he got revenge on the Arikara people, recruiting another trapping company led by Lieutenant Henry, 250 US soldiers, and hundreds of the finest warriors from the Sioux tribe, which had a deep loathing for the Ree people. Henry and the soldiers bombarded the village with cannons, eventually negotiating a surrender, which disappointed the US soldiers because they wanted close hand-to-hand combat with the Arikara. This decision especially infuriated Ashley and his people, feeling that they had been cheated of their chance of revenge. As the soldiers marched off in the distance, they looked back and saw these massive plumes of smoke, which they later found out was Ashley and his men returning to finish the job, obliterating the village completely. But this posed a huge problem for Ashley. He had lost so much money and resources in the 2 battles he had fought with the Ree people, forcing him and his men to live off the land. Because Glass was such an experienced hunter, it was one of his responsibilities to range out and find game for the crew to cook and eat. But on one fateful morning, he instead found a mother grizzly and her 2 cubs. Glass shot her with his rifle, ran to a tree, and began to climb, but she ripped him off the tree, throwing him to the ground. She ripped out a piece of his rear, throwing it to her cubs to eat. She then begins to rake her claws up and down Glass's back, when all of a sudden he wheels around, trying to get in a couple kill shots in with his knife, when his throat gets torn open, which is now gushing with blood. Hearing all the commotion, 2 hunters rush to Glass's aid, killing the bear with 2 musket shots, finally ending his torment. Ashley considered it unthinkable to leave Glass behind, even though almost everyone in the camp was sure that Glass wouldn't survive the night. But after 2 days, Glass was still alive, clinging on to life, and so they had to reevaluate their strategy. They were still in hostile Ree territory, still angry about their village being burned to the ground very recently, and carrying Glass in a stretcher slowed the entire group down immensely, putting them in imminent danger. So on the 5th day, when Glass was still alive, Ashley offered an $80 bonus, almost half a year's salary, to 2 volunteers who would stay behind and give him a proper burial once he passed away. These 2 men were none other than John Fitzgerald and a teenager only known as Bridges. They stayed with Glass for an additional 5 days, and after a total of 10 days now after the attack, Glass was still clinging on to life. He barely moved, his eyes flickered every once in a while, but his chest consistently rose and fell. But Fitzgerald grew restless. As a veteran of the forest, he knew that if himself and Bridges got caught by the natives, they would stand no chance. And so Fitzgerald began to reason with Bridges, telling him that Glass was going to die anyways, if not from his wounds, then from the Ree that would inevitably find him. And besides, they had already earned their money. Ashley and the men only expected them to stay for a couple days maximum, and 5 days was surely more than enough. Now, it is important to mention a major disparity between the movie and real life. In the movie, they depict this journey happening mostly in the winter, but in reality, this happened mostly in summer and early fall. And the fact of the matter is that if this journey was really done in the winter, it would not have been possible. There are many things that Glass depended on for his recovery, especially in the early stages, that simply aren't available in the frigid winter months. Firstly, Glass could barely move when he first regained consciousness, meaning that if Fitzgerald and Bridges did not leave him under that berry bush in immediate access of food, he would have died. Also, being that the berry bush was covered in leaves, it gave him cover from the Arikara scouts that were sweeping the area, sparing him from certain death if he was caught. Secondly, Glass allowed flies to land and produce maggots, eating the dead flesh and preventing him from getting gangrene. It's also worth noting that Glass's motivation for his heroic return was not because his son got killed, but rather because he was enraged by the fact that he could be left for dead, and not only that, the 2 men that were responsible for that stole his items. But I guess seeking revenge against a child killer is box office gold, right? All he wanted back was his rifle, which he nicknamed Hawken. After crawling a few miles, Glass discovers a pack of wolves gorging on a buffalo calf. He waits until they have their fill, and then he lives off the carcass for 5 days, making great strides in his recovery during this time. Glass pushes on, crawling and limping over rugged landscape, when, near the beginning of his journey, he is taken in by a friendly group of Sioux natives, where they clean the maggots off of his back and treat his wounds with their powerful herbal remedies. After 6 weeks, Glass joins a group of French trappers for an additional 6 weeks, when a re-ambush leaves all of the Frenchmen dead and Glass running again for his life. Luckily, a rider from the friendly Mandan tribe scooped him up onto his horse, saving him yet again from another re-butchering. After having his fill of dog in the Mandan village, he estimates he has roughly 400 miles left before he reaches Fort Henry, but in his stronger condition he is making great pace, and he even runs down bison calf when he is in dire need of food. It took Glass exactly 38 days to cover that 400 miles all the way to Fort Henry, but all he found was an empty shell. Now at this point it was November and the snow was coming down heavy in the forest. It is unknown whether the men left a note or if Glass followed their tracks, but he managed to make it to the new Fort Henry in roughly 3 days. The men were in such disbelief they thought he was a ghost, but after realizing that he is flesh and blood, the mood turned from fear to celebration. As Glass began to tell his story of survival against all odds, the men began to murmur, clamor, and whisper amongst themselves. But once he told them about the men that left him behind, the air grew quiet. They began to shift slightly until one man was left with his head bowed, and it was none other than young Jim Bridges, who was only 19, and the poor soul couldn't even look Glass in the face. Glass looked down at the man that he had traveled nearly 1,000 miles to kill, and his heart melted. He had remembered Bridges talking earlier about how he was sending all of his money back home because his sister was the only one alive, as his parents had both died. So Glass puts down his rifle, looks Bridges right in the eye, and tells him that he forgives him because he knows that it was Fitzgerald who persuaded him to leave in the first place, but takes the opportunity to scold the boy for being so easily misled by bad counsel and to make sure to behave better in the future. As it turns out, Bridges would do exactly that, becoming one of the most famous mountain men, having stories that are legendary still to this day. He was one of the first men to discover the springs and geysers of Yellowstone, and one of the only men of his time to take a raft down the rapids of the Bighorn, which were notoriously dangerous. After lecturing Bridges, he now realizes that he has a single target for vengeance: John Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald had earlier left Fort Henry to go to Fort Atkinson in order to join the army, and ironically may have even passed Glass on his way there. Glass wastes no time in recruiting 4 men to join him in his quest for vengeance, immediately setting off for Fort Atkinson. The men traveled on foot for several weeks, eventually making it to the North Platte River, where they made a boat out of buffalo hides and set off downstream. At a fork in the river, a native chief stood on the banks, calling out to them in Pawnee to come and parley. They left 1 man by the boat, and the rest of them followed the chief inland. Sometime during the parley, Glass overheard one of the natives speaking in the Arikara language and subtly tipped off the other 3 men that it was a trap. At the first chance they got, they made a break for it, but almost immediately, 2 of the men were cut down. 1 man made it back to the water and was immediately picked up by the other in the boat, and as they looked back to the shore from water, they realized that Glass is nowhere to be found, and so they thought that he was killed just like the 2 others. But once again, they were wrong. Instead of running back to the water, Glass ran inland, the opposite direction of everybody else, and lost the Arikara in the thick underbrush, and once again, Glass was alone in the wilderness. After another grueling 3 months, he finally makes it to Fort Atkinson, where he immediately seeks out Fitzgerald, but is stopped before he can kill him by Captain Bennett Riley, stating that if he kills a US soldier, he will be tried for murder. There are many versions of how Glass reacted to this information, but all of them ended the same way: him walking out of Fort Atkinson with his vengeance unfulfilled. After hearing Glass's incredible story, the captain felt the very least he could do was return Glass his rifle. And so he went to Fitzgerald's quarters, grabbed Glass's rifle, finally handing it back to its rightful owner, and Fitzgerald was never heard from again. Once the dust settled, Glass actually ended up joining another fur company, telling stories of the good old days as he had become somewhat of a legend by that point. In the winter of 1833, Glass currently lived at Fort Crass, built near the junctions of the Yellowstone and Bighorn River. Working again as a hunter, it was his job to supply meat for the trappers of the American Fur Company. One winter morning, himself and 2 other hunters set out from the fort looking to kill some game. And as they were crossing the Yellowstone River, found themselves surrounded by 30 Ree on horseback. They took Glass's clothes and supplies, and then they scalped him. The 3 men's scalped, naked bodies were found roughly a week later, and that is, unfortunately, the true story of Hugh Glass. There was nothing heroic about his death, and personally, when I was reading this for the first time, I was so disappointed, and secretly I was thinking, okay, it's not over, you know, he was just faking his death, or he's gonna explode out of a horse carcass and he's gonna be still alive or something, but no. That's actually how he died. It's so disappointing. I wonder in that moment when he got surrounded, did he actually know he was done for and, you know, that he was gonna die, or did he think that somehow he was gonna get away like he had been doing for the past 10 years, basically? I also find it ironic that in the movie he gets his revenge on Fitzgerald by letting the Ree scalp him, but in real life he suffers that same fate himself. Anyways, that's all for me. I'll see you guys in the next episode.